our third speaker, who again, in one of those little quirks, I only just realised, Bill, before, that Bill mentioned to me that he used to work for John Dawkins. And as I mentioned, this is the seventh seminar in this series under this particular project, and it'll be the last of the formal seminar series. We'll hopefully have some policy ones a bit later on. But it's very fitting that the first speaker in the first of the forums was John Dawkins, who inaugurated these series, so it is entirely part of the circle of life, Bill, that we welcome you to the stage today. Bill, of course, as most of you know, is the Executive Director of the Independent Schools Council of Australia. He was appointed Executive Director there in 2001 after some 35 years spent in federal government, both in public service and in advisory roles. He spent many years working in the education portfolio during that time, including being head of the schools division from 94 to 98. He was Chief of Staff, as I mentioned, for Federal Minister for Education, and has been instrumental in his current role in ensuring that the independent school sector is being heard by those who influence education policy and shape the national educational agenda. So Bill, welcome. It's over to you.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. When Kelvin was talking about his teaching days, it took me back to my days as a pupil like yours. And I think in my leaving class, and I went to a Christian Brothers school in Canberra, I think in the maths class we had 105 of us. Which explains why not too many of us knew how to add up or subtract. And in relation to Whitlam, I think the last time I stood in front of Whitlam was on the 12th of November 1975 outside the front steps of Parliament House. Me and a whole lot of other public servants at that time, before we were quickly reminded by our respective supervisors that it was a role of public servants to be neutral, and please go back to your offices, which we duly did. Sadly, some education commentators today would have you believe that the 1,100 independent schools in Australia and their 550,000 students and their 50,000 staff or thereabouts not only don't contribute to the common good, but in fact, by their very presence and nature, they work against the common good. So I'm going to try to put a different proposition to you today, and I'll concentrate just on two aspects. One is the economic benefits, and the second are the social benefits that the independent school sector has brought to Australia for many years. So firstly, on the economic benefits, funding of Australian schools is pretty complex. It's widely misunderstood. It's often misrepresented. I think Gonski's done a fantastic job in actually bringing together the complexity of it and coming up with a good theoretical model. Whether it works or not is a matter to be tested. But schooling's a $50 billion a year operation in this country. It involves federal, state governments and, importantly, parental contribution and community contribution. And it grows at about 6% a year. So 50 billion this year will be 53 billion next year if the indexation arrangements continue as they have done for many, many years. Some government funding has been available to independent schools since the 1970s. In fact, there was a little bit, depending on where you were, even before the 1970s. So it's been around for approaching half a century. And prior to that time, as Kelvin said, the costs of running schools, non-government schools in Australia, was met by churches and parents and the community fully. In contrast, governments, mostly state governments, have always fully funded public or government schools. Government support for students who attend non-government schools is now very much part of the schooling landscape in Australia. So despite half a century of essentially bipartisan support from the major political parties in providing some funding support for these students, there have always been debates about how the federal government should distribute funds to non-government schools. Not so much whether, although you do hear that. And currently what Gonski's doing is essentially having another debate about how. Federal governments over the years have always attempted to distribute recurrent funds to non-government schools on a needs basis, or more accurately, a relative needs basis. And one way of thinking about that and the challenge is to line up the 2,725 non-government schools in Australia in an order of need, or relative need, and getting it right. So the current funding model, the SES model, has been around since 2001 for independent schools, 2005 for Catholic systemic schools, and will be in place until at least the end of next year. So it's currently legislated to the end of next year. Something has to happen after that. It's not perfect by any means, but it does differentiate the needs on a needs basis, the vast array of schools in various different communities across Australia. That simply represents the SES model, the dollars that you get, depending on where you sit on the SES scale, differences between primary and secondary. So Commonwealth only, the support for students ranges from $1,329 up to $8,362, depending entirely on the circumstances of your school. Of course, Gonski's come up with a different model, although there's still an SES component to it. At least he's suggesting that that continues as part of the school's resource standard calculation. So this is high stakes game, potentially, I think, serious economic and serious social consequences for the Australian community, whether we get it right or wrong. Let's have a look at some facts. 1970 to 2011 enrolments in government, Catholic and independent schools. As Kelvin said, Catholic schools have operated over that period with about 18 to 20% of enrolments. Government schools had 78% of enrolments in 1970, they're down to 65%. So the independent sector has changed the equation. It's gone from 4% to about 14%. It depends how you count, of course. Remember, I wasn't very good at maths. Enrolment changes over the last 25 years. In rough terms, the independent sector has grown by 300,000, Catholic sector by 150,000, and the government sector by 64,000 between 1985 and today. If you have a look at what's happening in the capital cities, this is secondary enrolments by capital cities, and this is at the 2006 census. So when we get data from the last census, I think you'll see a shift in this. But setting aside Darwin, in every capital city in Australia, there are almost 1 in 2 children at secondary go to non-government schools. That was not the case back in the 1970s. My last facts, again from the ABS census 2006, again want to see the most recent census to recalculate this data. This shows family income and school choice. So family income, and I've called it low, medium, high. That's a bit risky, I realise. If you just take the high income bracket, that's the ABS defines that as family income of 104,000 or more. So that's 24% of the population which has children at school. So 24% of those families send their children to independent schools, 26.7% to Catholic schools, and 49.4% to government schools. So this is sort of dispels a bit of a myth about the rich send their children to non-government schools. Some rich do and some don't, and that's fine. Let's have a look at who pays for schooling. Kelvin briefly referred to this. This 2009-10 data. The blue or the purple that's what the Commonwealth provides for government, Catholic and independent schools. The red is what state governments provide, so massive funders of, almost full funders of state government schools. State governments also put 1.4 billion into Catholic schools and just under $1 billion into independent schools. Then parents or the community puts about $1.5 billion into government schools. Parents put 2.1 billion into Catholic schools and 4.4 billion into independent schools. If you were able to spend enough time analysing the My School financial data, this is what you'd come up with. So across the top line, this is net recurrent income per student, NRIPS. Government schools, 11,100. Catholic schools, about 9,700. Independent schools, 13,700. The next part of it is government income per student, very different. So government income per student for government schools is 10.5, the Catholic schools 7.7, for the independent sector 6.3. And then private income per student, and these don't add up, and there is a reason for that, is $645 per pupil in government schools, 2,800 in Catholic and 9,000 independent. It's an entirely different proposition depending on what school you are and what the circumstances of that school happen to be if you're in the non-government sector. Now, most reasonable commentators reject the proposition that school funding is a zero-sum game, with every dollar going to an independent or a non-government school being a dollar lost to government schools. That's clearly not the case. But given the time constraints today, I won't go any further into the funding data, but despite the fact that I'm no good at maths, I do know a little bit about this stuff. The last slide I will show is the sort of theoretical savings to government this is independent schools. So, in other words, if these children who are in independent schools actually were educated in government schools, governments would have to find that sort of amount of money at current average prices of government schools in order to educate them. So that's 3.6 billion in 08-09. I think it's 3.9 billion in 09-10. So again, it's increasing. Well, that's an increase of 8 or 9%. So parental and community investment in schooling is estimated to be 16% of total expenditure of schooling in Australia. In the non-government sector, the decision by parents to make a significant contribution to their children's schooling is made by choice, and it really represents a partnership. And the partnership clearly works considerably towards the common good. My final point on the economic side relates to what's going to happen in the future. I think it's a bit disappointing that Gonski hasn't, in my view, hasn't really addressed this. But by 2020, the Australian government says there's going to be an additional 700,000 students in Australian schools. And I've put that table together and I've simply added the last column. So they're saying that in 2020 there'll be an additional 414,000 students in government schools, 147,000 in Catholic schools and 150,000 in independent schools. If that's true of the independent sector, there needs to be another 300 independent schools by 2020. There are currently 1,100 schools. Let me tell you, that's not going to happen. That is an absolute impossibility. So the partnership equation, something has to happen if the current arrangements, the current balance of arrangements is going to continue. There is no way within the next 10 years that the independent sector is going to grow by 30%. I can't speak for the Catholic sector. It's a system, well, there are systems within the Catholic sector. Maybe they have more capacity to do that. But the whole concept of commencing an independent school, starting from scratch, setting up on a greenfield site, and turning it into a viable, effective, high-quality education facility is a big challenge, and the resources simply aren't there to do it. So the net result of all that is governments, by and large, are going to have to fund around about 1,800 new schools in the next 10 years. And that's going to cost governments a lot of money. I estimate that if governments are going to pick this up entirely, it adds about $10 billion a year to the recurrent costs. If you did it under the current mix, it'd cost governments about $8 billion a year, and parents would contribute about another $2 billion. So I think the other point on the economics of this is the OECD makes it pretty clear that expenditure on education in Australia as a percentage of GDP compares favourably with other OECD countries, but thanks largely to private effort. It's private effort, that's what makes a difference. So the independent sector contributes significantly to the common good, partly because parents and school communities make such a huge contribution financially and through other means. Parents in school communities, in our view, should be encouraged to contribute to the costs of schooling and certainly shouldn't be penalised. And Gonski certainly doesn't propose any penalties, which is a blessing. Indeed, I think these parents should be applauded. Their efforts ensure that the economic and social deal for the Australian community is a good one. Now, on the social benefits that independent schools provide, independent schools have historically and continue to be established with the purpose of meeting the educational needs of their communities. In doing so, it's representative of the Australian community, at least to some extent. And it represents the diversity of the Australian community. If you have a look at the affiliations of independent schools, that's pretty diverse. They're not all religious, but a lot of them are religious-based. And that's a school will only survive if the community in which it serves is prepared to support it. Many independent schools are affiliated with Christian denominations, but there's Jewish, Islamic schools, schools that promote a particular philosophy, Montessori's, Steiner's, schools that serve particular community groups, Indigenous community schools, special schools, students with disabilities, students from regional remote areas. If you look at the diversity, I think some of the public debates focus on a few schools in Sydney and Melbourne that are close to Sydney Harbour. The diversity is very, very much a different picture. So in the independent sector, for example, there's 9,300 Indigenous students. There are 36 independent schools where more than 50% of the enrolment are Indigenous. There's 12,000 students with disabilities. 57 special schools, there's 17,000 boarders. But interestingly, a very high proportion of independent schools quite small. Nearly 40% of independent schools have less than 200 students. Hence, going back to my earlier comments, if you think there's going to be another 300 of these, we're having ourselves on under the current arrangements. So there's a long-held consensus that education, and particularly the provision of schooling, is a public benefit. In fact, the common law has recognised this for over 400 years, and it's interesting that the federal government has decided that after 400 years it's time to actually turn this into a statute rather than have it sitting in the common law, and we'll see what happens with that initiative. The education of the individual not only benefits that individual, but the cumulative education of individuals benefits society as a whole. Schools provide a benefit to individuals by equipping students with the skills and knowledge to prepare them for life and employment, and a benefit to society by providing students with skills and knowledge to contribute to the social, civil and economic development of the nation. In this way, all schools, government, Catholic and independent, contribute to the common good. The importance of foundation schools' knowledge and experience and the associated social benefits of school education can be expected to increase rather than diminish in an increasing knowledge-based community. These benefits to the individual and to society are reflected in government policies relating to compulsory school attendance and to the trend to extend the age of compulsory school attendance. Each independent school, each non-government school indeed contributes to the overarching public goals of schooling. It's a condition of public funding that independent schools meet the community standards in education and commit to the Melbourne Declaration of the Education Goals of Young Australians. Along with all Australian schools, they must participate in the National Assessment Program, implement the Australian curriculum, ascribe to national values, publicly report school and student performance data, fully participate in the national education initiatives such as My School website, and are obliged to support the COAG outcomes of schooling which is set out in the National Education Agreement, even though they're not parties to the National Education Agreement. So, a couple of weeks ago, Peter Garrett spoke at the Sydney Institute, and he has some interesting things to say. This quote, I think, is worth reading. Non-government schools provide choice via a wide range of religious, cultural and pedagogical beliefs and complement government schools. They are a distinctive and valued part of Australian education. They provide a valuable education counterpoint in policy and practice and are integral to Australian education. These days, only the most blinkered of advocates see government and non-government schooling as an either-or proposition. So that was about 3 weeks ago, I think. So given that independent schools report to and are responsible to the communities they serve, an emphasis on fostering a sense of belonging and listening and responding to the community in order to meet the needs of the community is at the very core of independent schools. They build social capital within their own communities through the development of networks among families and organisations within the local and international communities, and through the values that underpin the formal curriculum. It's the experience of schools in the sector that families are seeking out schools because of their focus on building community, creating a sense of belonging and engaging with the wider community, locally, nationally and internationally. Although most independent schools are affiliated with a religious tradition, numerous parent surveys indicate that religion is usually not the most important factor in choice of school. It's outweighed by educational excellence, teacher quality, supportive caring environment, in short, a school's capacity to nurture students' full potential. Finally, it's been claimed that independent schools create intolerance and undermine social cohesion by reducing the opportunity for children from different social and cultural backgrounds to interact and develop an appreciation of diversity. According to this position, independent schools do not fully develop students as citizens for the common good. This assumption is not supported by Australian and international research. An analysis of data from the Australian Survey of Social Attitudes finds that people who attended independent schools do not express opinions that are less socially liberal or less tolerant of difference than people who attended government schools. On some issues, the opposite is the case. People who attended independent schools actually have higher rates of civic participation than people who attended government schools. So the tired argument that independent schools by their very nature are divisive, lead to social and religious segregation and undermine social understanding and cohesion does not stand up to scrutiny. Thank you very much.